dispatch, run badge number FL7624. Says he's FBI. I don't want to hear a word from you until I confirm this is stolen or bought on eBay, okay? You people pretend a lot.
Make sure this doesn't just go, officer. I am being harassed here, and I heard you say, you people.
That alone will make me take this up.
Before I'm proven
The body camera was already running when Officer Barnes stepped out of his cruiser on Meridian Boulevard at 9:34 p.m. on a Monday night in November. What it recorded over the next 19 minutes would end his career, trigger a federal civil rights investigation, and produce a lawsuit so substantial that the city's legal team would spend 8 months trying to find a defense before concluding that the footage made one impossible. The entire incident began with a lane change. It ended with a senior FBI agent in handcuffs on the side of a public road while his credentials sat on the hood of a patrol car in the November cold, examined and dismissed by an officer who had already decided what kind of stop this was going to be. And that decision, made before a single word was exchanged, before a single document was produced, before a single piece of evidence existed to support it, was already running on a body camera that was going to outlast every assumption Barnes had ever made about how the night would end. Davis Perry had been with the Federal Bureau of Investigation for 19 years. Not a recent appointment, not a junior agent finding his footing. A senior agent with nearly 2 decades of federal service behind him, organized crime investigations, public corruption cases, multi-agency task forces that had put people in federal prison who had spent years believing they were untouchable. He had been deposed in federal court more times than he could count without effort. He had run field operations in 4 states. He had the kind of institutional knowledge that takes 19 years to build, and that no credential alone can fully communicate to someone looking at it cold under a flashlight on a November roadside. That Monday evening, none of it was visible. He was driving home from the field office in his personal vehicle, a dark silver Accord, unremarkable, the kind of car that disappears in evening traffic without drawing attention. He was still in his work suit, the tie loosened by about 2 inches, the way a person loosens a tie when the day is technically over, but the mind hasn't fully let go of it yet. His FBI credentials and his service weapon, secured in a locked box in the trunk, as federal protocol required, were the only things in the car that distinguished it from any other dark silver sedan on Meridian Boulevard at 9:34 p.m. He had been driving for 20 minutes and was 12 minutes from home. Officer Barnes was 29 years old, with 7 years on the department. His service record contained the kind of language that reads as unremarkable until you count the complaints attached to it. 11 civilian complaints in 7 years, each one reviewed by a different supervisor, each one closed without disciplinary action, each one filed without reference to the ones that preceded it. He had never been asked to account for all 11 at once. Nobody had ever laid them end to end and asked what the sequence meant. He had been running his evening patrol loop on Meridian Boulevard when Davis Perry's Accord passed him in the left lane. Barnes pulled out behind it. He followed it for 6 blocks. The car maintained its lane, held its speed, signaled every turn. By every observable measure, there was nothing to stop. Barnes activated his lights anyway. Perry saw them immediately. He signaled, moved to the shoulder with the smooth, practiced compliance of someone who had been a law enforcement professional for 19 years and understood exactly what these moments required. He cut the engine. He rolled down the window. He placed both hands on the steering wheel and kept them there, visible, still, communicating everything that needed to be communicated before Barnes reached the window. He was not nervous. He had no reason to be nervous. He had done nothing wrong, and he carried the credentials to confirm it within arm's reach. What he did not know, what no amount of 19 years of federal experience could have prepared him to anticipate, was that Barnes had already decided, somewhere in the 6 blocks between pulling out and activating his lights, what kind of stop this was going to be. And that decision, made before a single word was exchanged, before a single document was produced, before a single piece of evidence existed to support it, was already running on a body camera that was going to outlast every assumption Barnes had ever made about how the night would end. Davis Perry had spent 19 years learning how power operated when it didn't want to be seen. That was the work, not the part that made the press releases, not the conviction announcements or the task force commendations or the framed certificates that lined the wall of his office at the field office on Meridian's North Corridor. The actual work was the patient, methodical process of understanding how people with authority misused it, how institutions protected that misuse, and how the distance between what the record said and what actually happened could be measured, documented, and eventually closed. He had done it for organized crime syndicates operating across 3 states. He had done it for public officials who had spent years believing their positions made them untouchable. He had done it in rooms where the wrong answer could end a career, and the right answer could end a freedom. 19 years, the kind of tenure that doesn't announce itself in a parking lot or a lobby or on a boulevard at 9:34 p.m. It simply exists in the judgment calls, in the reading of situations, in the particular patience of someone who has learned that the most consequential things rarely resolve in the first 5 minutes. He had started in the Detroit field office at 30, worked violent crime, transferred to organized crime at 34, and built the kind of record that produces a senior designation not because of time served, but because of what the time produced. 3 major prosecutions, 2 federal task force citations, a directorial commendation issued 4 years ago for work on a public corruption investigation that had reached into the offices of people who had every reason and resource to make it stop. He was, by any institutional measure, one of the most experienced agents in the regional division. None of that was on his face on Meridian Boulevard. He was just a man in a loosened tie, 12 minutes from home, with the particular mental exhale of someone whose day had technically ended. Officer Barnes operated on a different philosophy entirely. 7 years on the force had produced in him what some departments reward and others quietly tolerate, a style of policing that his evaluations described as proactive, and that his 11 civilian complaints described in considerably less flattering terms. Proactive in Barnes's operational vocabulary meant moving toward situations before they fully developed. It meant not waiting for observable violations when instinct suggested something worth investigating. It meant treating certain people and certain cars on certain roads as data points that warranted attention regardless of what the observable evidence said. 11 complaints, 7 years, 0 disciplinary actions. The lesson in that arithmetic is not subtle. When a pattern produces no consequence, it doesn't stay the same size. It grows because the absence of consequence is its own kind of instruction. Every dismissed complaint told Barnes, in the only language that modifies behavior, that his instincts were correct and his methods were acceptable. He had been wrong about both for 7 years. He just hadn't met the evidence yet. That was about to change on Meridian Boulevard, 19 minutes before everything did. Barnes reached the window without explaining why he had activated his lights. That omission was not accidental, and it was not minor. Department policy required officers to inform drivers of the reason for a stop within the first 30 seconds of contact, a procedural requirement that existed because the reason for a stop is the legal foundation everything else is built on. Without it, the stop has no articulated basis. Without an articulated basis, everything that follows it exists on ground that the law does not recognize as solid. Barnes had been on the force for 7 years. He knew the policy. He asked for license and registration instead. Perry provided both without hesitation. License from his wallet, registration from the glove box, each retrieved with the visible, deliberate movements of someone who understood that clarity of motion was its own form of communication in these situations. He handed them through the window and then, before Barnes had finished looking at either document, told him quietly that he was a senior FBI agent and that his credentials were in his interior jacket pocket. He asked permission to retrieve them. Barnes looked at him for a moment in the way people look at something they have categorized before examining. Then he said Perry could reach for them, slowly. Perry produced the credential folio with the same unhurried precision he brought to everything, opened it, held it at window level where the flashlight Barnes was carrying could illuminate every detail without requiring Barnes to move. The photograph, the badge, the bureau seal, his name, his designation, his field office assignment, all of it printed in the format that federal credentials have used for decades, in the specific typography and security features that any law enforcement professional with 7 years on the job should have encountered enough times to recognize. Barnes looked at it for 4 seconds. Then he laughed. Not a small sound, not the brief involuntary exhale of someone caught off guard, a full, dismissive laugh that the body camera captured in audio clear enough that it would later be played in its entirety for a federal jury without requiring any amplification. He said the words that would follow him for the rest of his life, into every courtroom proceeding, and every news cycle, and every conversation about what happened on Meridian Boulevard that November night. He called it a cereal box badge. Perry did not react to the words in any visible way. He had spent 19 years in rooms where composure was the difference between a productive outcome and a catastrophic one. And that training did not distinguish between a federal interrogation and the roadside stop conducted by an officer who had just mocked his credentials on a running body camera. He remained still. He provided his badge number. He provided the direct line to the FBI field office duty supervisor, a number that would have resolved every question Barnes claimed to have in under 60 seconds. Barnes put the number in his pocket without dialing it. This is the moment the stop became something other than a stop. Not when the lights came on, not when Perry was asked to exit the vehicle. Here, in the decision to receive verification information and deliberately set it aside, is where Barnes made the choice that transformed a procedural encounter into a federal civil rights violation. He had the number, he had the credentials, he had a senior FBI agent sitting calmly in his personal vehicle on a Monday night telling him the exact truth. He chose on a running body camera to not verify any of it. Barnes had a partner that night. Her name was Officer Reyes. 4 years on the force, a record that contained 0 excessive force complaints and 2 commendations for de-escalation in situations that her supervisors had noted, in writing, could have gone considerably worse without her presence. She had responded to Barnes's location when she saw his stop activate on the unit tracker, standard practice for night patrol, where officers kept loose proximity to each other as a matter of safety. She had pulled up behind his cruiser on Meridian Boulevard and stepped out while Barnes was still at Perry's window, arriving in time to hear the credential exchange and the laugh that followed it. She read the situation in the time it took her to cross from her cruiser to Barnes's position, the folio still open at the window, the badge visible under Barnes's flashlight, the senior agent sitting with both hands in plain sight, his composure so complete it had its own specific quality. Not the stillness of someone suppressing panic, but the stillness of someone who had decided before the conversation began that nothing Barnes did would move him off his own axis. She stepped alongside Barnes and looked at the credentials. Then she looked at Barnes. She said it quietly, the way you say things to a colleague when you want the message to land without becoming part of the official audio record any more than necessary. She told him they should call it in. She said the badge looked legitimate and the bureau seal looked right, and that verification took 60 seconds and cost nothing, and that the cost of not verifying, if the credentials turned out to be genuine, was a number neither of them wanted to calculate on a Monday night. Barnes told her he had it handled. She tried once more. She said Perry's name as it appeared on the license, using the full name, the way you use a full name when you want to remind someone that the person in the car is a specific individual with a specific identity and not an abstraction to be processed. She said the field office number was right there and suggested Barnes make the call before the situation developed further. Barnes turned to her with the expression of someone whose authority had just been questioned by the one person present who wasn't in handcuffs yet. He told her, on a running body camera, that he was the senior officer on this stop and that he didn't need a verification call to tell him what his instincts already had. Then he opened Perry's car door. He didn't ask Perry to step out. He opened the door, reached across the threshold of a personal vehicle on a public road without consent, without a warrant, without any legal basis that 7 years of departmental training could have produced to justify the motion, and told Perry to get out. Perry looked at Reyes. She looked at the ground. He stepped out slowly, hands raised to shoulder height, the body camera capturing every inch of his compliance. A 19-year federal agent pulled from his own vehicle on a boulevard 12 minutes from his home because an officer had decided that instinct outranked evidence, and that total authority meant never having to verify the thing that would have ended it all in 60 seconds. Reyes stood beside her cruiser and said nothing. She was already doing the math that Barnes refused to do. counting the cameras, counting the credentials, counting the 19 years behind the man now standing on the asphalt, and arriving at a number that told her exactly how this night was going to end. She just couldn't stop it from getting there. The handcuffs went on at the 9-minute mark. Not because Perry had resisted, not because he had raised his voice, made a sudden movement, or given Barnes a single observable justification for the escalation. He had done the opposite, standing on the Meridian Boulevard shoulder with his hands at shoulder height, his suit jacket open, his demeanor so professionally calibrated that Reyes would later describe it in her statement as the most controlled response to an illegal detention she had witnessed in 4 years on the force. Barnes cuffed him anyway, citing obstruction, a charge that the body camera would later demonstrate had no factual basis in anything that had occurred in the preceding 9 minutes. Perry stated clearly, once, that the detention was unlawful. Then he went quiet. Not the quiet of someone defeated, but the deliberate quiet of someone who understood that every word spoken from this point forward was evidence, and that the most valuable thing he could contribute to what was coming was an unimpeachable record of his own conduct. The search began. He went through the accord with the thoroughness of someone who needed to find something and had not yet accepted that nothing was there to find. The glove box, the center console, the back seat, the door pockets. Each search producing nothing that any honest inventory would describe as suspicious. Registration documents, a charging cable, a folded district map, 2 pens, a coffee receipt from that morning. Barnes documented none of it. He moved through the interior with the energy of a man whose theory of the situation was still running on its original fuel, regardless of what the evidence kept failing to provide. Then he reached the trunk. The locked box was exactly where federal protocol required it to be. Secured, labeled, entirely consistent with every regulation governing the transport of a service weapon by an off-duty federal agent. Barnes photographed it before opening it. The body camera captured the photograph being taken, which would matter later because photographing evidence before disturbing it is something officers do when they believe they are about to find something. And what Barnes found was a legally secured federal firearm and a credential folio that matched the one he had already dismissed as a cereal box badge 40 feet away and 8 minutes earlier. Perry watched from the shoulder, hands cuffed behind him, suit jacket pulling at the shoulders from the restraint position. 17 years of organized crime investigations had required him to sit in rooms with people who were actively trying to determine whether he was who he claimed to be. And he had survived every one of those rooms by doing exactly what he was doing now, letting the evidence speak at its own pace, trusting that the record would close the distance between what Barnes believed and what was actually true. The body camera was still running. The distance was closing. Barnes just couldn't feel it yet. Reyes made the call without telling Barnes she was making it. She had been standing beside her cruiser for 11 minutes, watching the search produce nothing and the situation compound itself with the particular momentum of a mistake that has been given too much time to develop. She had tried twice at the window. She had watched Barnes open the car door without consent. She had watched the handcuffs go on a man whose credentials she was increasingly certain were exactly what they claimed to be. At some point, the calculation shifted from how do I stop this to how do I limit what this becomes. And the answer to the second question was the field office number that Perry had provided at the window and Barnes had put in his pocket without dialing. She dialed it herself, quietly, beside her cruiser, while Barnes was photographing the trunk. The duty supervisor answered on the second ring. She gave him Perry's name, his badge number, and her location. She asked for confirmation of active employment status for a senior agent matching that designation. The supervisor's response came back in 14 seconds, not because the question was complicated, but because the answer was immediately available and the person on the other end of the line understood, from the nature of the call, that 14 seconds was already too long. Confirmed. Senior Special Agent, 19 years, currently assigned to the Organized Crime Division of the Regional Field Office. Reyes stood beside her cruiser for a moment with the phone in her hand and the confirmation in her ear, doing the arithmetic that the situation now required. 19 years, senior designation, handcuffed on a public boulevard, searched without consent, credentials dismissed as fake on a running body camera. She walked toward Barnes. She said his name once. He turned from the trunk. She told him. The body camera captured what happened to Barnes's posture in the 4 seconds following the confirmation in a resolution that left no interpretive room. The shoulders that had been squared for 19 minutes dropped first. Then the jaw, which had been set with the particular tension of someone whose certainty was load-bearing, went slack in the specific way that certainty goes slack when the foundation it was resting on disappears all at once. He looked at Perry, still cuffed, still standing, still carrying the same professional composure he had arrived with, and something moved across his face that the jury would later spend considerable time discussing. It wasn't guilt exactly. It was the expression of a man who had just understood in a 14-second confirmation the full weight of what the next months of his life were going to look like. He didn't move toward Perry immediately. He stood at the trunk of the Accord with the locked box open in front of him, the service weapon and the credential folio visible under his flashlight, and said nothing for a long moment that the body camera recorded in its entirety. Reyes walked past him and began removing Perry's handcuffs herself. She didn't wait for Barnes to give the instruction. She didn't ask for permission. She simply did the thing that needed to be done, on a running camera in a way that the record would later distinguish clearly from everything Barnes had done in the 19 minutes preceding it. The bully and the coward, it turns out, are often the same person, separated only by the moment the confirmation comes through. The first federal vehicle arrived 11 minutes after Reyes made the call. Not a single agent in a personal car. 3 black SUVs moving in the coordinated sequence of an institutional response that had been activated at the supervisory level and was arriving with the full weight of what that activation meant. The duty supervisor who had confirmed Reyes' identity in 14 seconds had not ended the call at the confirmation. He had transferred it upward immediately to the section chief, who had transferred it further, because the nature of what Reyes had described on that boulevard was not a miscommunication to be sorted out quietly between 2 departments. It was a federal agent, handcuffed, searched without consent, credentials dismissed as fake, on a running body camera. That combination of facts produced a response that the local department had no procedural framework for receiving. The SUVs pulled onto the Meridian Boulevard shoulder in a formation that closed the space around Barnes's cruiser with a deliberateness that was its own kind of communication. Doors opened. Agents stepped out in the unhurried way of people who arrive knowing they have more authority than anyone currently on the scene and have no need to announce it loudly. The senior agent leading the response identified himself to Barnes by name and title and asked, in a tone that was professionally courteous and entirely without warmth, for Barnes's body camera footage to be flagged for immediate preservation. Barnes looked at his cruiser, then at the SUVs, then at the agents. He said something about department protocol for footage requests. The senior agent let him finish and then explained, with the patient precision of someone who had made this particular jurisdictional point before, that the request was not being made under local department protocol. It was being made under federal authority, which operated in a different register entirely, and did not require the local department's cooperation so much as its awareness that cooperation was the significantly preferable option. Barnes' sergeant arrived 4 minutes later, summoned by a call that had come not from Barnes, but from the department's own command structure, which had been notified by the field office before the SUVs left the parking garage. The sergeant stepped out of his vehicle, assessed the scene in the way that senior officers assess scenes they were not present for and already know are going to require significant paperwork, and walked directly past Barnes to introduce himself to the federal response team. The jurisdictional geometry of that moment was visible to everyone on the shoulder. The local department's ranking officer had arrived and prioritized the federal agents over his own officer, not as a personal judgment, but as an institutional acknowledgement of where the authority in this situation actually resided. Barnes stood beside his cruiser while agents photographed his equipment, documented the scene, and collected statements from Reyes, whose account of the evening was thorough, accurate, and not particularly favorable to the officer she had spent 19 minutes standing beside. The lesson that federal jurisdiction teaches local authority when the two come into direct contact is not complicated, but it is consistently underestimated by the people who learn it the hard way. The badge on your chest determines your authority within your jurisdiction. What it does not determine is what happens when the person you have handcuffed on a public boulevard holds a designation that answers to a different chain entirely, one that does not file complaints and wait for internal review, but arrives in 3 black SUVs 11 minutes after the confirmation call and begins collecting evidence before the scene has had time to settle. Perry sat in the back of one of the SUVs, while his wrist was examined by a medical officer the response team had brought. The mark from the cuffs was photographed and documented. His statement was recorded in full. Every detail of 19 minutes on Meridian Boulevard was entered into a federal record that would grow considerably larger before it was finished. Barnes remained on the shoulder. His sergeant hadn't spoken to him directly yet. The body camera was still on his chest, still running, still recording a scene that had moved so completely beyond anything his 7 years had prepared him for that the only available posture was stillness. He stood very still. The federal grand jury returned its indictment 43 days after the stop on Meridian Boulevard. The charges were precise and thoroughly documented: unlawful detention, conducting an unconstitutional search without consent or probable cause, filing a false incident report, and civil rights violations under color of law. The false incident report charge carried its own particular weight because Barnes had written in the official document submitted to his department the night of the stop that Perry had been uncooperative and had refused to provide identification. The body camera footage showed the credential folio presented at the window within the first 90 seconds of contact. The jury didn't need the charges explained. They needed the footage played, and the footage played itself. The civil lawsuit was filed concurrently. $20 million, settled on the record permanently. Barnes was terminated before the settlement was finalized. His appeal to the termination decision was reviewed and denied. His application to 3 other departments in the following year was rejected by all 3, each citing the public record, the federal conviction, and the body camera footage that remained, as these things tend to remain, the first result in any search of his name. He was 36 years old with a federal conviction, a terminated career, and a name that the footage had made permanently, specifically and irrevocably known. He had spent 7 years building a professional identity on Meridian Boulevard. 19 minutes had documented the end of it in a resolution that closed every interpretive gap he might otherwise have navigated through. Davis Perry returned to the field office the Monday after the indictment. He had not taken extended leave. He had not made public statements beyond what the Bureau's communications team released in coordination with the civil litigation. He had continued working, the same cases, the same methods, the same patient and methodical process of building records that told the truth about how power operated when it didn't want to be seen. The irony that his most recent case study had happened to him on a public boulevard at 9:34 p.m. on a Monday night was not lost on him. He simply added it to the body of evidence he had been accumulating for 19 years. He gave one statement after the settlement. He delivered it without notes in the measured, unhurried tone that 19 years of federal work had made his natural register, and it covered exactly the ground he wanted it to cover. He said that accountability was not a courtesy extended to people with the right credentials. It was a structural requirement, the load-bearing wall of any institution that claimed to operate under the rule of law rather than the preferences of the individuals temporarily holding authority within it. A badge, he noted, was not a credential that elevated its holder above the law. It was a credential that placed its holder under a higher standard of it. The expectation was not that officers would be perfect. The expectation was that when they were wrong, the system built to catch that wrongness would function, not protect the officer from consequence, not review each complaint in isolation until the pattern became invisible, but function, catch it, name it, answer for it. He said that 19 minutes on Meridian Boulevard had cost him something that no settlement figure could fully address. Not the physical discomfort, not the professional disruption, but the particular experience of being a person whose identity, credentials, and 19 years of documented service were dismissed in the time it took an officer to decide, before reaching a window, what he was looking at. He said he was telling the story because the people who couldn't afford a federal lawsuit, who didn't have a field office that dispatched 3 SUVs in 11 minutes, who didn't have 19 years of institutional credibility behind their account, those people had been stopped on Meridian Boulevard too. They just hadn't had the same resources when it ended. That, he said, was the part that needed to change. Not just the accountability for the officers who acted wrongly, but the infrastructure that made accountability accessible, regardless of whether the person in the car happened to carry a badge that outranked the one at the window. Barnes is currently serving his federal sentence. His earliest release date is 4 years away. His father, who had been on the force before him, has not commented publicly. His former colleagues have not either. Perry still drives Meridian Boulevard. Same route, same time, same dark silver Accord. The tie is usually loosened by the same 2 inches. He is, on any given Monday evening, simply a man 12 minutes from home. The body camera footage is now required viewing in 6 law enforcement training programs across the state. It is shown without commentary in the first viewing because the people who designed the curriculum determined that commentary was unnecessary. The footage makes its own argument. It always did. If this story held you from the first body camera click to the last word of Perry's statement, if it made you think about what accountability actually requires, about what changes when the pattern finally becomes visible, about what it costs when it doesn't, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Stories like Davis Perry's exist because the camera was running and someone refused to let the record be rewritten. We tell them because the people who don't have 19 years and 3 black SUVs deserve to have their stories told too. If you want more stories about power, accountability, and the moments when the system was forced to answer for itself, hit that like button right now, subscribe to this channel, and tap the notification bell so you never miss a video. We post stories exposing racial profiling, police misconduct, and the people who fought back, and we are just getting started. Every story matters. Every view is a witness. Don't miss the next one.